In this video in our fallacy series, we're looking at another one of the varieties of ad hominem called ad hominem inconsistency. So what we're going to do are 8 main things. We're going to look at what the ad hominem inconsistency variety is. We'll look at the structure of the argument. We'll talk about what makes it a fallacy, what makes it bad argumentation. Then we'll look at some common situations in which you can expect to see this occurring or arising. We'll look at 3 examples of the fallacy so we can do a little bit more analysis. We'll talk about some pointers for how to spot it or what to be on guard for. We'll talk about what other fallacies not to mistake it for those students who need to be able to distinguish it apart from other fallacies. And then we'll finish by talking about how to avoid the fallacy in your own argument, your own communication, your own reasoning processes. So, what is this particular version of the ad hominem fallacy? Now, it has a couple different names. Sometimes it's called the tu quoque argument, although that is sometimes also used for the two wrongs make a right, which we'll talk about as sometimes getting confused with this. Sometimes it can be called an accusation of hypocrisy, or a very popular term in politics these days is flip-flopping. Now, it's a variety of the ad hominem argument, so it's against the person, which focuses on some inconsistency, some either real or alleged inconsistency on the part of the person making the claim. And how does this work? The claim that's being made by the person is rejected on the basis of saying that there's an inconsistency between the particular claim that's being disputed and other claims that the person has made in the past or the present, or might even be imagined to be making in the future, or with their actions, either present or past. It could even extend to, if we're talking about entire, groups or institutions, we could be thinking about policies as well. And it says because there's this inconsistency, therefore the claim must be false. That's where the real problem lies. Now, if we look at the structure of this, it's not a very complicated fallacy. A is claiming something to be true. We'll call it X. And A is also being pointed out as in some way committed to Y. Y could be an action, Y could be some other belief, Y could be some stupid thing that the person said 20 years ago. And the hidden premise is that X is in some way inconsistent with Y, so that therefore X must be false. And if we look at it in this way, we can see that this is not particularly good reasoning. It's not going to be a valid deductive argument. It's not even really a particularly good inductive argument if we try to weaken it a bit. If we look at the structure in graphic terms, what you see is we've got 2 people here. Person B is the one who's engaging in the fallacy. Person A is claiming that X is true, and then person B points out, look, there's some sort of inconsistency here on the part of person A. Why? Because there's also some claim or some action Y which supposedly contradicts X or is in some way incompatible with it. So what does that lead us to? The conclusion that X is therefore false. Now, what's wrong with this kind of argumentation? Why is this a fallacy? Well, we need to remind ourselves, as we do with so many other fallacies, that a claim can be true independently of, and then in this case, whether the person who makes the claim is or seems to be committed to something inconsistent with the claim. These are 2 different things. It's quite possible, in fact, it happens all the time, that a person who is inconsistent makes true claims or provides good justification for claims. Very often, people are not consistent entirely across the board. What's being ignored here is the possibility of a person becoming better informed about a matter and then changing their beliefs or actions with respect to it. We'll see a few examples like that where people are accused of flip-flopping. And another thing to point out here as well is that in general, situations that are similar ought to be treated similarly. That's a basic principle, but only if the similarity is a relevant one. So there are quite a few cases where somebody's going to be accused of inconsistency when they're not really being inconsistent. There are cases in which some situations should be treated unequally. It depends on what the relevant factors are. So, what are common situations in which we're going to see this arising? Well, one common type of situation is where a person has been making claims based on their best knowledge at the time, but they have altered their view. There are many processes in which we should expect this to be the case. For example, the process of education or even training, right? If you come in and you know it all already, there's nothing to change on your part. Situations of therapy are a great example as well, where people, arrive at hopefully a more adequate perspective. It also is common in situations in which comparisons are likely to be made between people, between situations. So, what are some of the common ranges of contexts? Well, personal relationships and conflicts. This is a very common accusation on the part of many people, and indeed there may in fact be inconsistencies, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the person, what they're saying, thereby becomes false. Common living situations, when you got to live with other people, you observe them from day to day to day, inconsistencies will often come to light. Politics and policy making, we see this all the time. The internet has made this even more of an issue, in part because everything gets saved somewhere, anything that somebody says, and there's many more resources for doing fact checking or supposed fact checking, seeing whether people are being consistent across the board. Giving advice. Sometimes, people think that if you give advice to a person in one situation, you should be giving exactly the same advice to another person in what may be a very different situation. And they want to point out inconsistencies there. Journalism. There's a lot of gotcha journalism that goes on. This ties in with the politics thing as well, but also with, popular culture. There's a tendency on journalists' part to think that if they uncover an inconsistency, they've really done something amazing. And what we always have to ask is, well, what is the relevance of that inconsistency? Educational settings. This goes both ways, too, by the way. Students love to point out any sort of inconsistencies on professors or instructors' parts, while ignoring inconsistencies on their own part. In return, many professors do this as well, and grade student papers in a way that their own work probably couldn't measure up to. The workplace happens a lot in terms of reporting, in terms of policies, in terms of hiring decisions, and in trade and commerce as well. If you're going to say that we should do this in this case, why aren't you saying the same thing about this over here? Perhaps your claim is thereby false. So let's look at a few examples now. Here's a common sort of accusation made in politics, and which has made its way into the popular culture about other things as well. Flip-flopping, going back and forth about something. In this case, I'm using John Kerry. We could also use Mitt Romney about the abortion issue, where he had one stance and then shifted to another stance. So John Kerry took a lot of flack. And by the way, I'm not a fan of John Kerry for a lot of reasons, but this is not a fair attack on him. Was the Iraq War a major mistake? John Kerry now says yes, but you can't trust him on that. He voted for the authorization to use force, and he came out saying that Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and needed to be disarmed. He was, by his own admission, for it before he was against it. Now, this became a catchphrase in terms of an appropriation that bill that Kerry was involved with, having to do with appropriating money for continuing military operations. He was for it before he was against it. It could be that he actually arrived at a better conclusion. More information became available. You're not going to find many supporters of the Iraq War and the way it was handled these days, even among people who originally supported it. So, if we want to say the Iraq War was therefore justified, that's a big stretch. Kerry was wrong in opposing it because of inconsistency. No, it could have arrived at a better conclusion. Here's another common situation. Who are you to tell me XYZ, where XYZ is something that's bad for you or bad for another person or, foolish or something like that. So this is very common with children and parents and, between the two generations. Who are you to tell me that I shouldn't smoke? You smoked for years, and you started as a teenager. So therefore, it's false that I shouldn't smoke. And, this goes against the evidence that smoking is, in fact, bad for you, perhaps even worse for you as a kid than it is as an adult. And there's a lot of things that get dismissed this way. This is a fallacious example, but we could tie this in with all sorts of imprudent decisions on people's part. Here's another one. Nobody should get special treatment. You're treating that person differently than all the other job applicants because he's your cousin. That's unfair. Sure, he is the person most qualified for the position, but he shouldn't go to the head of the line just because he's related to you. So the what's being rejected here is saying, your view that this is the person most qualified or the right person for the job is wrong because you're being inconsistent. Probably also being unfair and nepotistic and all these other things that we could roll in there as well. You're not treating equal cases equal. But in this case, you're treating unequal cases unequally, which seems to be the right thing to do. So how do we spot this fallacy now? Well, one thing to do is pay attention to what uses are being made of another person's previous or current assertions in evaluating the truth of a present claim. What are they actually doing with that? Also, be on guard against certain types of people. There are some people who spend an awful lot of time and energy on ferreting out inconsistencies on other people's parts and less time on determining whether these inconsistencies are actually relevant. They lack a sense of perspective. They're more interested in trying to find some sort of contradiction or something they can point to. And they often don't spend a lot of time evaluating the claims on their own bases. They're content to focus on who actually has a totally consistent story. A lot of times, and here's another thing, a lot of times those who focus on alleged inconsistencies of those who they disagree with are not consistent themselves in applying this across the board. So Republicans focus on Democrats' inconsistencies and then give their own people a pass. Democrats do the same exact thing with Republicans. The same thing happens in the atheist versus theist discussions. There are glaring errors and foolishnesses that are tolerated by people on one side, where if the other side commits it, they're right there ready to criticize it. And so there's an inconsistency in the way that inconsistency is often handled. And you want to be attentive to that. Now, for those of you who are students who need to be able to identify this fallacy in opposition to other fallacies, we want to look at a few other ones that are easy to confuse us with. So it is an ad hominem fallacy, and you might blur this into the circumstantial variation depending on what sort of attack on the person is being made. The key to distinguishing these is looking at the grounds that are being relied upon for dismissing the person's claim. Is it fundamentally about inconsistency, or is it fundamentally about what their commitments are? There are cases where it does get kind of blurry because we often do reveal our commitments or our background or circumstances through the things that we say and do, but you can usually distinguish those. It's also different from, although very, very similar to, I'll admit that, two wrongs make a right. What's the fundamental difference there? Here, you're rejecting somebody's claim and saying, look, there's some inconsistency here. Think about the smoking one, for example. If the conclusion was, hey, it's okay for me to smoke because you smoke too, and smoking is stupid for you to do, so it's okay for me to do something stupid, that's two wrongs make a right. When it's couched more as an attack on the person, as well, who are you to make a judgment when you do the same thing yourself? That's the inconsistency fallacy. Now, if the other person's actions or claims are largely or entirely irrelevant to the claim under consideration, then what we're probably dealing with is either a non sequitur where there's no connection between these things whatsoever, or the red herring fallacy. You point out with the red herring fallacy, you point out, well, so-and-so said this, and let's explore this for a while, and you totally distract from what the original subject was. With this inconsistency, this fallacy of ad hominem inconsistency, we are looking at what the person did say and we're comparing it to other things. So it's not one of those fallacies. Now, here's an important thing to think about. How do you avoid engaging in this sort of thing yourself? And I've got a couple different pointers here for you. So one thing, right off the bat, always a good thing to do, when you're assessing the truth or falsity of claims made by a person, try to focus on the claim itself and whether the claim can be justified independently of the person making the claim. If you need to reject a claim on the basis of who the person is or what they've said, there's something kind of strange going on there. Here's another point. When you see what appear to be inconsistencies in a person's claims or actions, you got to ask, are these actually relevant? There are going to be inconsistencies. It's a question of whether they apply, whether they fit. And that's not something that there are hard and fast rules for. A lot of that depends on cultivating prudence or practical wisdom. Realize as well that just like you, other people sometimes, start out with an inadequate position that they think is adequate at the time, and they say all sorts of stuff and they do all sorts of stuff, and then later on they come to realize, well, I kind of made a mistake in my commitments, and now I view it this way instead. Sometimes you need to give them a pass. Sometimes actually that should be evidence that they're more reliable if they've gone from less knowledge to more knowledge, from foolishness to wisdom. You don't want to dismiss what they're saying just on the basis of some inconsistency that you're seeing between past and present. Also, this is something very important to keep in mind. Realize it's extraordinarily rare to find a person or a group who is entirely free from any perceived inconsistencies. And also realize it's possible to hold or develop a position that seems free of inconsistencies but is still mistaken. The lack of inconsistencies is not the hallmark of absolute truth or reliability. And it's foolish to take it as being such, because you can be totally crazy but manage to make your crazy system consistent, and we don't want to say that that's good critical thinking. So you want to have a little bit of intellectual humility when it comes to this sort of stuff. Last thing I want to say is this particular video is part of a series on the fallacies, and that particular series is part of a larger channel which is devoted specifically to critical thinking, logic, and argumentation. So if you enjoy this video or you found it useful, share it with other people, check out the other videos and series in this channel. We're constantly adding new content to this, and we'll be building it over the next few years or so.